father have been jailed for a total of more than 30 years for the death of a 2-year-old girl. Lola James was murdered by Kyle Bevan at her home in Pembrokeshire in July 2020. He'll serve at least 28 years, while Lola's mother, Sinead James, will serve 6 for causing or allowing her daughter's death. The High Court has been told Prince William agreed a very large settlement with the publisher of The Sun over phone hacking. It's emerged in court documents filed by Prince Harry's lawyers as part of a separate privacy case against News Group newspapers. The company wants the claims dismissed, while Kensington Palace is refusing to comment. Scotland's First Minister has told LBC he's confident the SNP can survive the recent controversy around its funding and finances. His predecessor, Nicola Sturgeon, has made her first appearance in Holyrood following her husband's arrest as part of a police investigation. She insists she had no idea about the inquiry when she announced her resignation.
I understand the view that some people might have, that I knew this was all about to unfold and that's why I walked away. Nothing could be further from the truth. I could not have anticipated in my worst nightmares what would have unfolded over the past few weeks.
Earlier, the party's former treasurer, Colin Beattie, said he didn't know the party owned a £100,000 motorhome. He was the second person to be questioned as part of the investigation into how £600,000 was spent. Humza Yousaf has told Andrew Marr donations will not be returned if there is no second independence referendum.
Look, again, we're not reimbursing people for the donations that they have made. People make donations to the party because they want to advance the cause of independence. Every pound and penny they spend, that we spend, as a party, will be on advancing the cause of independence.
Joe Biden has asked voters to give him more time to finish the job as he formally announced he's running for re-election. If the US president wins in 2024, he would be 86 at the end of a second term at the White House. And Harry Belafonte, the groundbreaking singer and actor who became a civil rights activist, has died at the age of 96. He started as a jazz singer before moving to calypso. He was prominent in the civil rights movement and became a confidant of both Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 21 points at 78.91. The pound buys $1.24 and €1.12. LBC weather: isolated showers moving into the far north tonight. Clear spells elsewhere with some light rain in the southwest, a low of -4. Cloudy in southern and central areas tomorrow with patchy light rain in the southwest. Brighter elsewhere with wintry showers in the far north, a high of 13 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Amelia Cox.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 7:04 on LBC. We have a very busy programme tonight. At 7:45, the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, will be joining me live in the studio to update us on this airlift out of Sudan. Lots of developments on that today, which you've been hearing on Andrew Marr's show. And then at 9, we're going to be talking about Joe Biden announcing that he's running for president again. But first, it's the second in our phone-ins this week, really partly to do with the local elections. Yesterday, if you were listening, you will have heard Greg Hands, the Conservative Party chairman. Tomorrow, we have the Deputy Leader of the Lib Dems, Daisy Cooper, and on Thursday, the co-leader of the Green Party, Carla Denyer. They'll be taking your calls. And today, it's kind of half and half. It's half our monthly phone-in and half on the local elections. Rachel Reeves, welcome back.
Great to be here.
Now, I've been seeing pictures of you virtually every day out on the campaign trail. Do you actually genuinely enjoy campaigning? I mean, you're not going to say no, I know.
I really do.
Because you look as if you enjoy it.
I do, and I get something out of it. You know, like too much time in politics is spent in Westminster and not enough time actually talking to the voters who decide elections. And, I find it really exhilarating to hear what they've got to say and to make sure that's feeding back into the process. I mean, it's the first involvement I had in politics was going out campaigning ahead of the 1997 general election. Now, that made it seem easy because every door you knocked on was supporting Labour after the 18 years of Conservative government. But I've been in the last couple of weeks in Gravesend, in Rochester, in Swindon, obviously in my own constituency in Leeds, and I'll be going later this week to Mansfield and Sheffield before getting back to my constituency in Leeds. And, every door-knocking session is different. You'll meet people from all different types of backgrounds, all walks of life, and all with different opinions and something to contribute and something to make me think as well.
Well, Rachel's here till 7:45. We're streaming this live on Global Player 2, but do get your calls in, 0345 6060 973, and you can text 84850 and say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. Now, be honest here. What were the main issues coming up on the doorstep? Because I know you're going to say cost of living, and I'm sure it did. But are there any other issues that people were really wanting to bend your ear about? I mean, Diane Abbott, just to name one.
The main thing that people were saying yesterday, and yesterday I was in Gravesend and in Rochester, that they want change. They don't like the way that things are going at the moment. And they're sick and tired of things. Whatever they were talking about, it wasn't just the cost of living. They're talking about, their experience of waiting to get a doctor's appointment, or, on a waiting list for an operation and not getting it, or, in fact, I was on the high street in Gravesend yesterday and said, when do you ever see the police on this high street? So there was just this feeling, there is just this feeling that things aren't working very well today. And I think the strongest, the common theme wherever you are is this desire for change. I'm not saying that everyone is saying, and therefore I'll be going out and voting Labour at the next election. There's still work for Labour to do to seal that deal, but certainly people are in the mood for change.
If people are slightly sceptical, because I get a lot of people phoning in here saying, well, look, I voted Tory for the last 2 or 3 general elections, but I want to vote Labour, but they still haven't quite got me yet. What are you sensing? What are the issues that are still preventing people from voting Labour?
So I think it's different for different people. Everyone's got their own story to tell of, who they're voting for and why. One of the things that I do hear a lot, and really does worry me actually, as somebody who cares about democracy, is this feeling that the problems in Britain today are so great that no one can fix them. And that does really worry me because, if people just turn their backs on politics and turnout goes down, then, what mandate does whoever get elected have? But also, I want people to have hope that things can be better because things are in a mess today. And I think, whichever political party you're in, I'm sure you must agree with that. Things are in a mess today. And it's the job of my party and all other parties to come up with some ideas and solutions. Look, I think that Labour are doing that, but obviously there's more to do to convince more people. And, the local elections are a week on Thursday. Look, I'm optimistic and I'm hopeful that Labour will make gains and that it will show that Labour are on the route to forming a government at the next election. But it's all work in progress.
Labour
absolutely.
does need to make quite big gains next Thursday, doesn't it? Because in 2019, it was a terrible night for the Conservatives, but it was also a bad night for Labour. And I don't think you made any gains at all, which in opposition you would expect to do so.
Yeah.
So everyone's going to expect you this time to really pull it off and maybe... I mean, I don't know what expectations you're setting. This is always the thing in elections, isn't it? You always say, well, it's going to be a difficult night, but you've got to get over sort of at least 500 gains, haven't you?
I think if you think about the local authorities that I've just mentioned, where I've been, Medway has had a Conservative council for 25 years. I don't think Labour has ever had overall control of the council there. Swindon...
But it did used to have all of the parliamentary seats along the North Kent coast, didn't it?
It did, and we haven't since 2010, I think maybe even before 2010. Swindon, we lost both of the parliamentary constituencies 13 years ago. We lost control of the council 20 years ago. So the places we're going are not places that, we just lost in 2019. These are places that we lost a long time ago, but we have reason to believe that things are changing in those areas. And I'll be in Mansfield later this week, which Labour lost to the Conservatives as a parliamentary constituency in 2015. So, look, we are trying to win back voters in all parts of the country, some of whom voted Conservative for the first time in 2019, some who stopped voting Labour years, in some cases more than a decade ago. So, look, we are optimistic and we're hoping to make gains in those places where Labour support has withered over the last 5, 10, 20 years.
Well, let's go to your calls. Let's go to Geraldine in Waltham Forest, first of all. Hi, Geraldine.
Yes, hi.
Hi.
Nice speaking with you. What I want to know is what is Labour going to do about the sewage in UK waters? I'm somebody who always went on holiday in the UK. I will not be doing that again, and I can't see that that can be good for local economies as well as the environment. I think it's absolutely scandalous that we're in this situation.
Yeah. Where did you go on holiday, Geraldine?
Well, I've been in Kent, I've been to the Lake District, and I make a point, we've been making a point for years now, but now I'm afraid we won't, and I'm sure I'm not the only person, and I feel terribly, terribly sad about this, and I can't believe this is happening. I can't believe we're in the UK in the 21st century has got sewage in its waters. I just think it's one of the biggest scandals.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for phoning in, Geraldine. And I think you're absolutely right to say that, you know, our beautiful isles are being damaged, not just the seas, but the rivers, the lakes, waterways in general, by this terrible outflows of sewage. And Labour have committed to have mandatory monitoring, not just a sort of, you know, the random, you'll be lucky if someone comes to check your water this year, and then mandatory fines. And then consequences for the bosses of the water companies if they don't put this right. It cannot be right that bosses of water companies that are polluting our rivers and our seas are still getting bonuses and still paying dividends to their shareholders. And we need a much tougher regulatory regime to ensure that that doesn't happen and that the onus is on those water companies that are making big profits to put this right. And we will make sure that it's properly monitored, properly fined, and there are consequences for bosses who time and time again don't fulfil their obligations to protect the quality of the water in our seas and our rivers and our lakes.
You've had an Opposition Day debate on this today, I think, haven't you?
Yes,
and the government, as I read it today, they've kind of shot your fox on this. They've stolen your clothes. They've almost copied your policy.
Well, no, so we had a debate, Geraldine, on this in Parliament today, and we had a very strongly worded debate, but the government have got a majority, and they deleted the consequential parts of our motion. They amended them and then voted for the amended motion, but it took out all of the bits that would actually make a difference. And in the end, it's going to be Conservative MPs who have to explain to their constituents why they watered down a Labour motion today, something that would have actually made a difference. And I think, Geraldine, you're not the only one that's talking about this. You know, one of the wonderful things about our country is that we are lots of islands and beautiful islands. And I think I was watching the David Attenborough programmes with my family, and nobody in Britain, I think, lives more than 70 miles from the sea, and most of us live a lot nearer than that. They really matter to us, and we don't want them polluted. We want to be able to use our rivers and our seas and our lakes.
Everyone's going to agree with that.
Well, you know, but the Conservatives have a chance to vote for things and to do things. They've had 13 years, and look at the state of it.
You and Geraldine are both talking as if this has never happened before, that this is only something that's recently happened. Now, I completely accept it's happening more than it used to.
I mean,
but this has always happened,
massively.
hasn't it? There's always been sewage pumped into this. I mean, I remember standing on the seafront at Blackpool at one of the party conferences and looking at this pipe and thinking, what's that coming out of that pipe? And it became very obvious what it was. Yeah. And this was right in the middle of the beach.
But so water quality improved hugely, and then it's deteriorated in the last few years. And I think what also really winds people up, and certainly winds me up, is you've got the companies that are making big profits, paying out dividends to shareholders, paying huge bonuses to their bosses. And what are they doing for that money? They are polluting our natural environment, our greatest asset.
Geraldine, good question to start with. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks,
keep your calls coming at 0345 6060 973. Rachel is here until 7:45, and then she's going off to the local comedy club. Not... Well, after your little joke there. It's never good when you have to explain a joke, is it? It's 7:15.
This is LBC.
18 minutes past 7. Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, is with us, and Labour MP for Leeds West. Your calls are flooding in, 0345 6060 973. Let's go to Tawhid, who is a new caller in Newcastle. Hello, Tawhid.
Hi, Rachel. My question is, what would you, as Chancellor, do to maintain and grow the small and medium-sized businesses we have right now, but also to create an environment, rather, where businesses and entrepreneurs can actually come in and start their businesses?
Well, thanks for that question, Tawhid. And, small businesses employ, I think, more than half the people in the economy and are the lifeblood of most local communities. So a really, really important role. Last year, I asked Lord Jim O'Neill, to do a review for the Labour Party on how to make Britain the best place to start and grow a business, because lots of businesses, startups, had said to me that, there's loads of entrepreneurialism in Britain. You see it everywhere you go. Every small retail park or industrial estate all around the country. But there is a challenge that businesses have in scaling up and getting to the next level that doesn't exist in countries like the US, for example, where that access to cash and finance is much greater. So Jim did a review for us looking at how, for example, we can get more long-term investment to some of the businesses of the future. But it's also why I've been talking quite a lot recently about high streets and town centres and how we can get them thriving again, because I don't know about where you live in Newcastle, Tawhid, but I think a lot of people's experience of when they go to the town centre or they go to their local shopping street is that there's frankly a lot of boarded up shops. Shops that used to be high street names have now disappeared, and there is crime and antisocial behaviour on high streets that is just going untackled. And so Labour have committed to reducing business rates for high street and small businesses to give them a bit of a break.
By how much?
Well, we've said by around £2,500 for a small business, and we would do that by changing the way that business taxation works. So at the moment, if you're a big global multinational, you may be paying no business rates at all, and you'll certainly be paying them at a lower rate because you've got an out-of-town distribution centre rather than a premise on the high street. And so it's why we've said that we should bring in this global minimum rate of corporation tax that the Tories have been talking about, and I hope they get on and do in conjunction with other countries. But otherwise, use the digital services tax to raise the revenue to help the smaller businesses. So that's something that Is that
a firm commitment that you would bring in a digital services tax?
Well, there is a digital services tax already today. We want to have this global minimum rate of tax, which is something that President Biden proposed, and it should be coming in the UK this year. And we could use some of the proceeds of that to reduce business rates for the smaller and high street businesses, because they are the medium-sized business, the big employers of tomorrow. But at the moment, you have to pay business rates before you make a penny of profit. In fact, you pay business rates before you even make a penny of turnover. And it is a disincentive for businesses to take on premises and to grow.
Tawhid, what would you like to see Labour commit to in terms of helping small businesses?
It's the funding gap. It's the funding that isn't available for a lot of these businesses or entrepreneurs that have an idea on a place that they want to start their business in, but they don't have the funding there. I was listening to the Prime Minister's conference speech, Business Connect, and I've also been looking at the website that he suggested in that the government has. So that is something that I'm looking at right now, but I'm looking at what the Labour Party will do to help these people with an idea or something that they want to start a business in. But how will
we published this review
help with the funding?
Yeah. So we published a review last year in December called Startup Scale Up, and it was looking at exactly these issues and looking, for example, at how the British Business Bank could better target support at some of these fast-growing businesses that struggle to access the finance that they need to grow and expand. And one of the things that is concerning is a lot of businesses that are growing quickly move to the US because that's where they can access the capital and the finance. I don't want to lose our best businesses. businesses to the US or anywhere else. I want to keep them here in Britain, creating the jobs and the prosperity here in the UK. But I know at the moment there's a big draw to going overseas, where there is more of that culture of angel investment, of pension fund investment into those startup and scale-up businesses of the future.
Do you think all the banks that we know of, do you think they've abdicated their responsibility in this area? I think most businesses have just given up on their banks now, and they don't even bother asking them because they know what the answer's going to be.
Well, I had a round table event with small businesses yesterday in North Kent, and what one of them said to me was he applied for a business bank account and it took weeks and weeks, even though he banks with that same bank. I won't name the bank, but he banks with that same bank. Well, no, because then someone else at the table, I had the same problem, but that was with a different bank. And he said, until you had that business bank account, you couldn't go for contracts, you couldn't bring in the clients, and things like that are so frustrating. But also there is this sort of culture in the UK, sadly, of investors investing in the sort of safe, the big businesses, rather than, supporting, as you have in the US, with the venture capital and equity investment in those startup and scale-up. So it's a really, really good point, Tahid. Do look at our review, Startup, Scale-Up, and if you've got thoughts on that, do get in touch with me.
Another great question, Tahid. Thank you. Let's go to Ferdy, who is in Harrogate. Hello, Ferdy.
Hi there. My question for Rachel is, what is the Shadow Cabinet's current position on nationalisation of key utilities, particularly energy?
Thanks very much, Ferdy. And Harrogate, not far from me in Leeds, is a beautiful part of the world. I've said as Shadow Chancellor that I'm not going to make any spending commitment where I can't say where the money's going to come from, because you saw the problems that Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng and the Conservative Party got into last year, where they started making unfunded commitments to cut taxes, and that crashed the economy, pushing up mortgage rates and borrowing costs for everybody else. So look, I'm not going to announce a load of money to nationalise companies where I don't think that's going to deliver for customers. But we have said specifically...
Do you think the existing companies either are delivering for customers or can do?
Well, look, I think that with water, for example, in the answer to Geraldine's question at the beginning, you've got to have tough regulation that actually bites, that says to companies, when you're delivering a public service like water, you can't pay out massive bonuses and dividends.
But why haven't we now? I mean, there is a water regulator, there is an energy regulator, and they both seem to be completely toothless.
Well, that's the responsibility of the government, because they set the mandates of those regulators. And, we had an opposition day motion in Parliament today to toughen up the regulation on water, and the government amended it to make it absolutely toothless.
How can Ferdy be confident that you talk tough in opposition, but often when politicians talk tough in opposition, then they get into government and the civil servants then come along and say, well, actually, it's not quite as easy as you think to do this, and these are the reasons why we can't do it. And this is a more general question,
you go in with a mandate. So you put something in your manifesto and you have a mandate to deliver and responsibility to deliver.
When you look at, shall we say, a recent example of accusations of the civil service sort of blocking a cabinet minister, i.e. Dominic Raab, do you look at that and think, well, I may not like Dominic Raab, but he did have a right to force his agenda through because he was elected to do it? Do you worry that the same thing could happen to a Labour government?
I think having an agenda and wanting to deliver on it and then bullying staff are two very different things. And, I've worked in big organisations in the past, and, I'd like to think that everyone I worked with thinks that I treated them with respect, even when I wanted to make changes that were sometimes difficult. And so I think there is a world of difference between having a clear agenda of what you want to achieve, which I think that employees respect, whether they're civil servants or people who work in the private sector, and then the way you go about delivering change. And I've always found that if you want to deliver change, taking people with you on that journey rather than bullying them into submission is the best way forward. Let me just also say to Ferdy, one of the commitments that we will have in our manifesto is to create something called Great British Energy, which will be a wholly publicly owned company that can invest in things like generation of wind and solar and hydrogen power, because we think there is a gap there, and that despite the fact that we have got huge potential in some of these industries of the future in new energy generation, too often, it's actually a bit like Tahid's question earlier, too often those investments are made by foreign companies rather than giving a return to the British economy and British taxpayers. And so GB Energy would be the Labour way of getting that energy generation and those jobs of the future in some of those communities.
Now we're out of the EU. You can do that, but you wouldn't have been able to do this if it had been the EU, would you? You couldn't have created a company to do that because there would have been lots of rules to prevent you.
If you look at France, for example, they've got Electricité de France, EDF, which is now wholly owned by the French government, and they're in the EU. So I'm not convinced you couldn't do these things outside of the EU, but this is something we've committed to doing in government.
Right. Ferdy, thank you. A text question here from Simon in Gloucester. Would Rachel be prepared to work with the CBI at all in future? I think everyone knows the context of this.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Simon. So at the moment, we've got no contact at all with the CBI. I found it very, very difficult to read some of the stories about what's been going on there, and particularly some of the revelations in the newspapers on Friday of last week about multiple rapes. And, this is an organisation that was supposed to represent business, but also drive the highest standards in business. And they're obviously incapable of doing that right now. I don't know whether they're going to be able to sort this out. That's up to them and the members that they've still got left, and they've lost an awful lot of them. I think it is important that you have organisations that can represent businesses. I work with others like the Federation of Small Businesses, Make UK, the British Chambers of Commerce, the Institute of Directors. But, the CBI did play an important role in lobbying government and the opposition. They are not able to do that today.
I was talking to Paul Novak, the new General Secretary of the TUC, on the programme last Thursday, and I said, look, don't take this the wrong way, but given that it's happened at the CBI, does it make you think, well, could this be happening in our organisation? I said, I'm not trying to smear you at all, but I think this ought to lead people who lead all sorts of big organisations, maybe small ones too, to try and investigate whether this sort of thing has been commonplace in their organisations, and then implement regulations or rules to stop it happening in future.
Yeah, look, I think this is a wake-up call about what is going on in organisations, because people were afraid to speak out. People are only now speaking out about what's happened at the CBI because one brave woman spoke out. And sometimes that is what's needed. We've seen this in Hollywood, for example, where one person spoke out and then a cascade. And sadly, I think there's probably no part of society where there isn't this. Sadly, I think there's sort of underlying culture and problems, and a lot of the CBI stuff, I hope it is an exception because it is a protest.
Right, we'll continue with your calls to Rachel in just a few moments' time. You're listening to LBC at 7:31. Amelia Cox has the news headlines.
It's understood around 40 British nationals have landed in Cyprus following the first evacuation flight out of Sudan. A little more than 2,000 people are trying to get out of the country, where a 72-hour ceasefire seems to be holding. A stepfather will spend at least 28 years in prison for the murder of his 2-year-old stepdaughter. Lola James was killed at her home in Pembrokeshire in July 2020. And the High Court has heard Prince William settled a phone hacking claim against Rupert Murdoch's newspaper group for a very large sum. It's emerged in court documents submitted by Prince Harry's lawyers in a separate privacy case against News Group newspapers. The company wants the case dismissed. LBC weather: isolated showers moving into the far north tonight. Clear spells elsewhere with some light rain in the southwest. A low of -4 degrees.
This is LBC.
Really?
7:35 on LBC. Rachel Reeves is here, the Shadow Chancellor. We have 10 more minutes with her. Let's go to your questions. Gary, who's a first-time caller, is in Rainford on Merseyside. Hello, Gary. What would you like to ask?
Yeah, the government have just announced now some benefit payments of potentially up to £900 over the next 12 months to help with fuel increases and inflation. As a pensioner, only 66 in February, I am living in private accommodation, private landlord accommodation. None of these benefits will be applicable to me, as I will not be entitled to any of the fuel benefits because I'm living in an all-inclusive property. However, my landlord has increased my rent due to these fuel increases. Also, I can't claim any of these benefits because I can't claim pension credit. Because to claim pension credit, you have to be below £187 a week. And my state pension is £803 a month. How would the Labour government look to help me to meet the extra costs?
Gary, thanks very much for your question. I think that's really concerning that your landlord is not passing on any support to you, if that's what you're saying. I certainly have heard other stories of landlords getting previously some of the support with energy bills and not passing it on to their tenants, which is, really despicable. And I do think that we need to have more protections for people in the private rented sector, because your experience that you're in your 60s and you're privately rented is becoming a more and more common experience because the availability of social housing has plummeted. And I do think there needs to be greater protections around evictions, for example, about increases in rent, about notice periods, about having pets in a private rented property, things like that. And so it's why Lisa Nandy, my colleague, has said that we would introduce a new charter for the private rented sector if we win the next election. But you're also asking about the specific support available, and there is this problem that if you don't meet the specific criteria in the government's rules, you get absolutely nothing. There's no gradation.
Isn't there a discretionary fund that local authorities have, which maybe
there was
Gary
earlier? I'm not even sure if that exists anymore, but you should have a look to see whether in Merseyside, I think you're in, whether there is any support from your local council. That certainly was available the first time round, but I'm not sure if the government had put that in this
Gary,
this time.
That's worth investigating. Contact your local council. Just ask if there's this discretionary fund. It may not exist. We're not quite sure about that. Let's go to Mike in Beverley. Hello, Mike.
Hi, Iain. Hi, Rachel. Yeah, another housing question, but a bit different. What changes would you make to the planning regulations to enable us to build more houses quickly? And I say that in light of the fact that Gove vetoed a plan that was locally approved.
Yeah. I think that there needs to be. Where do you live?
Beverley.
Beverley, right? Okay. Another beautiful part of the world. Mike, I think you're absolutely right to draw attention to the lack of house building. I think that the forecast from the House Builders Federation is that house building next year is going to be at its lowest level for 75 years, and yet we know that demand for housing, as people live longer, for example, is increasing, and we need homes for people, and we need homes for people in the areas that they want to live, to be near to the jobs they want to do as well. So I think that those housing targets should come back. The government have said, and Rishi Sunak said this on a Conservative home phone-in, I think it was, just last week, that he scrapped the targets because of pressure from Conservative Party members. Well, there's about 100,000 Conservative Party members, if you're lucky, and there are millions of people who are living in a private rented accommodation, for example, who would desperately like to get on the housing ladder, but can't. And that's one of the reasons why we see rents, and, this was the issue raised by Gary, the last caller, rents are going up because there is that pressure on housing. So we do need to bring back those targets, but then give local councils discretion to decide where the housing is most appropriate in their communities. So the targets set by government, because we need that housing to be built, but then discretion for local communities to decide the type of properties and in the areas that it should be.
Jennifer in Peterborough has texted to ask if you think we just need to accept we're all going to be worse off and stop asking for pay rises, as one of the Bank of England's bosses has said. Now, this is the Bank of England chief economist, Hugh Pill. You used to work for the Bank of England, didn't you? Was that your
many
job?
Years. Or to tell people to just suck it up.
He says the public needs to accept that we're now poorer and that workers should stop asking for pay rises and businesses stop asking for higher prices for products. And then a week ago, he said, well, higher unemployment is the price we have to pay for inflation. What's he doing?
Well, I think it is important that politicians don't interfere with what the Bank of England
Well, you can have
say.
an opinion on
but
it.
Let me just say this. I do not think that Britain's best days are behind us. I think we can grow our economy and create more good, well-paid jobs where people have got more money in their pocket to spend on the things that they like. But that requires a change in direction on the economy. It means prioritising ordinary working people.
He's basically saying whatever you do, we're all going to be worse off.
Well, I don't accept that, and I think that idea that somehow things can't get better is just wrong, and we can do an awful lot better. Yes, the last decade has been really, really tough. It's been the biggest fall in real incomes, I think, ever, and we've also had big tax rises these last 10 or 13 years. But things can be better. We can grow the economy. We can create those good quality jobs, paying decent wages in all parts of the country if we prioritise economic growth. And that does mean like reform to planning, including on housing. It means ensuring that those jobs of the future, whether it is in offshore wind or green steel or hydrogen energy, that we get those jobs here in Britain, because other countries are stealing a march on us, and we need to make sure that those jobs of the future come to Britain, and that people who live here and work here today get the chance to do those jobs. And then I think that we do have a great future to look forward to, because we're a fantastic country doing brilliant things, but we have lost our way these last few years, and we need to get back on track.
A slightly not cryptic question here from Majahid, who says, question for Rachel, which is the worst historical atrocity, 300 years of slavery or the Holocaust? Well, you know what's behind that question, don't you, Diane Abbott?
Well, I think, both of those things are terrible periods in our history, and I don't think there's any hierarchy in racism. Racism in all forms is absolutely abhorrent, and we should stand firmly against it. And
is there a way back for Diane Abbott?
I think that what she said was anti-Semitic, and there's no place for anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. There's an investigation going on now. She'll have a chance to put her defence, but she was the Labour whip was removed from Diane Abbott within a matter of
But she
hours.
has apologised, which Jeremy Corbyn never did, and that's the reason why he's not allowed to stand as an MP. The fact that she has apologised would indicate that if there's a law of natural justice, at some point she ought to be allowed back.
Well, look, let's see what her defence is for what she said. But what I read in The Observer at the weekend was anti-Semitic, deeply offensive, and those sorts of views have no place in the Labour Party.
Did you immediately ring Keir Starmer up and say you've got to get rid of her?
I was campaigning in Medway at the time.
On a Sunday?
What?
You'll
Yes, is that
lose
okay?
a lot of votes on campaigning on a Sunday.
I was campaigning at the time, and my phone started beeping. And look, my view was that Keir had been very clear about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. When he became leader, he said his first job was to root out anti-Semitism. I think that he's made huge advances in doing that, but we cannot let it creep back in. That's why it was really important to make that swift decision on Sunday to withdraw the whip from Diane Abbott.
Rachel, thank you for coming in. We've got a lot more calls that we could have taken, but I do have to finish on time because we have the Defence Secretary waiting. You don't keep a Defence Secretary waiting, do you?
Really important issues around Sudan.
Exactly.
So,
Rachel Reeves, thank you very much indeed. As I say, in a moment, we'll be talking to Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, about the current situation in Sudan. It's 7:45.
LBC.
7:47 on LBC. Don't forget cross question at 8. Our panel consists of Christina McAnee, General Secretary of Unison, Lord Harrington, Richard Harrington, Conservative peer, former Refugees Minister, Catherine West, Labour Shadow Minister for Asia and the Pacific and MP for Hornsey and Wood Green, and Dan Hodges, a columnist for the Mail on Sunday. The lines for that are open now, 0345 6060 973. Well, I think everyone today has been really concerned about what's happening in Sudan, the fact there are so many British citizens stuck there. I'm delighted that Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, has joined me in the studio to bring us up to date on the airlift that I think is happening right now, Ben.
Yeah, as we speak. We went in this morning in the early hours, returned back to the airfield that we had. The airfield is...
This is not the actual airport in Khartoum,
no.
is it?
So the airport in Khartoum right at the beginning had been damaged by the fighting. The runway had been mortared. So that has been out of action even before the airlift had started over the weekend, which was one of the challenges for everyone in getting out. So this is a military airfield 30 kilometres north of Khartoum, controlled by the Sudanese Defence Forces. And they've given us permission, and they gave the French and the Germans permission to use it. The Germans are currently facilitating that airfield. They have taken out a significant number of their nationals and dual nationals, and they will be handing over the airfield, which we will then facilitate from tomorrow. But just like anyone else, as allies, we're flying in. We flew in when the French were facilitating it over the weekend. Then there was the Germans. So we're all sort of helping each other. So as we speak, we have a aircraft pretty much on the ground, and there'll be 2 out tonight and then a number tomorrow, and we'll keep on doing it as long as we have the permission of the Sudanese, and indeed that the security situation allows us to do so.
One of the things that I've noticed on social media is criticism from people on the ground say, well, it's all very well to have these flights, but to say, well, it's up to you to get to the airfield, we're not getting any protection. Is that situation likely to change?
Well, I think what listeners need to understand is it's very hard to give advice that is a perfect fit for everyone. So different parts of Khartoum are not war zones. Some are, some aren't. Some are functioning perfectly normally. And one of the reasons we had to go and get the diplomats and their dependents, including children, out was because the diplomatic quarter or area is situated between the 2 warring factions' headquarters. So there was a lot more fighting and targeting. And also our ability, because people are not moving around, to know exactly what was going on was very limited. So, we just can't give advice to every single person individually. What we can do our very best is to advise them of the low-risk option, effectively. So stay in your home was, at first, a low risk because there was fighting outside the door. It's very unpredictable conflict between, effectively, the army of Sudan and this former sort of militia. And so it's literally each suburb might be different, each checkpoint might be different. So the early advice was stay at home, and we'll register to contact us, and we'll try and contact you when the time is right. But what changes are things like access to water and food, and that suddenly tips. The risk changes. You're better off not staying at home, potentially. And we had the ceasefire, and we have some better stability at the moment.
But 30 kilometres, it's quite a long way.
Yeah, it takes about an hour.
And if you have no access to a car, if you have no access to fuel, because I gather that's quite difficult at the moment, how do you even get there?
Well, at the moment, we have said make your way to the airfield because... that's what the Germans have done. That's what others had done, and that has seemed to work, and it does seem to work. But of course, it's not going to be that easy. But it is, it is functioning. People are managing to get through, and if people take their car, they can they can leave it at the airfield. It's more benign where the airfield is, so they need to get through the checkpoints. We have seen so far the checkpoints are helpful, both the Sudanese armed forces and indeed the other faction. In fact, we've seen reports of them holding people and helping them and saying, don't go at night, go later. But you're right. Of course, if people are completely on foot or on their own, but, Khartoum is a place that, you can access, taxis and things like that. They still run. The taxi drivers will run in anything, actually, and people are getting there. And I think there is a potential. We do have the ability to go and get people, but the danger starts when you start going, you draw attention to them, you start turning up. Of course, we wouldn't turn up, in disguise. It would be quite obvious we are foreigners, we are coming to pick up people, and so we have to make that.
But why can't you send in more planes more quickly? Because part of the criticism that you've had, and I didn't need to remind you, but is that this is Afghanistan all over again, that this is not doing enough for British citizens quickly enough. The Germans have got their people out, the French have got theirs out, the Irish, I think the French have taken some Irish citizens out, and we have a lot more than any other country, but we've taken fewer out.
Well, first of all, this is not Afghanistan, and people need to understand, in Afghanistan, the Taliban gave us all about 20 days, so there was a permission of certainty, and they were in control. Secondly, we had a military footprint already established previously. We'd been there 20 years, so the ability to facilitate people was much easier. I mean, at the beginning of this, there was no one on the ground. The diplomats and their children were hunkered down. So there really was, when the first French plane, I think, went in, they were sort of going blind. They were flying in. They had permission from the leadership of the Sudanese armed forces, but you never know on the person running the airbase. It is their combat airbase. It's where they're flying their warplanes. So, there was a lot of unknowns, and I think that is important. And, we did actually go. We went in exactly the same time as the French, but we went into the city, picked up people, and then took them to the airfield, whereas the French went to the airfield and then went into the city. So this sort of sense of we were all behind everyone, not the case, except, yes, you're right, at the beginning we took out, like the Americans, the diplomats and their families. That was the decision. But as the situation became more permissive, the Prime Minister quite rightly took the decision we would start bringing our more entitled personnel. People have registered on a website. In the internet, about 99% of them are in Khartoum at the moment. So there is a window, and that's why we're coming in. We're going to carry on doing it until the permission runs out, or indeed, the numbers reduce. And the Germans are leaving tomorrow, and we will take over the facilitation at the airfield. And the reason the Germans are leaving is people have stopped coming in large numbers.
Because I was watching you at the Defence Select Committee this morning, and Tobias Elwood, the chair of the committee, seemed to be quite perplexed about the fact that we were kind of reliant on waiting for the Germans to leave.
No, there's only one person can facilitate at a time, and that isn't stopping our planes coming in. The French were facilitating the airport when our planes went in. Our planes came in today, and the Germans. It's just only one can facilitate the airfield. We will take over from the Germans, and if the Spanish or the Italians or anyone else wants to fly in, we'll be the ones giving permissions, effectively. I mean, it is still under the control of the Sudanese armed forces. So it's not, if we all tried to elbow each other out of the way, it'd be chaos.
And you've got, I think, 2,000 applications in at the moment from people. Are you differentiating between dual citizens and what are called mono-citizens?
No. So first of all, people could register on the internet. I don't know the latest figures. There is a challenge there. The internet coverage, mobile phone coverage is really poor. And people will say, I haven't heard anything back. They've probably been contacted, but the network doesn't let them, it isn't working. Now, we have brought some technology in which we will try and deliver more texts to do that, and I think that will help with people. But ultimately, we will try and bring people out as we can with all the advice.
And of course, there is another route out, not just through the airfield, through the port of Sudan, I gather. How's that working?
So the UN convoy and the Saudi convoy left to the port of Sudan. That's a 500-mile trip, but it is one of the major ports. It is on the Red Sea. We put some Marines in yesterday, the day before, to recce it. We linked up with the Sudanese Defence Force, the armed forces, to get permissions. We've got all the permissions. In fact, it's a much more benign area. We've seen British citizens arriving. We've seen them just take their own ferries, take a ferry across to Jeddah and get a commercial airfield. So it's less of a sort of a national evacuation event there. It's more of a sort of guided signposting. And to go to your earlier question about the eligibility and who, look, British passport holders, whether they're dual national or mono-national, obviously will be evacuated. People of different passports, they could be Sudanese, they could be Chad, they could be anyone, who have a visa in the UK of a right to remain or a similar type of visa, And obviously the difficulty, which I know from my own experience in Afghanistan evacuation, is, then people have children, right? So with the reason we've put border force in countries, not everyone has documented children, because, how many 2-month-old babies have passports. So that's why the border force are there to look at that and help that, and if necessary, take the right decisions to get those people out.
You've had quite a lot of criticism from opposition politicians over this operation so far. Yesterday on our programme, Dave Dugan, the SNP's defence spokesman, said this.
This is a scandalous abdication of responsibility by the United Kingdom government. Many people, many UK nationals, not the least of which will be the 4,000 who are now stuck in Sudan, will be wondering, what is the point in having a colossally expensive diplomatic service with embassies and consulates around the world? What is the point in spending £50 billion a year on our defence forces when push comes to shove? Our political leaders are scared to deploy those resources.
Have you been scared to deploy resources?
No, and I mean, look, it's an interesting observation from a man who wants to leave the United Kingdom and reduce his armed forces to a rubber dinghy and a few people for ceremonies, because that's what the SNP defence policy had reduced. No, I mean, we have deployed our forces, we put people at risk in order to rescue British people, and we're doing that right now. We are in an airfield at the whim of the Sudanese armed forces, in a middle of potentially a conflict. We are, putting people at risk. Other people have been shot at in other nations who went to go and get their nationals. And I think he's talking nonsense, to be honest.
Ben Wallace, thank you for coming in to talking to us, bring us up to date with what's going on in Sudan. Coming up in the next hour, we have LBC's Cross Question. Christina McAnee will be joining us, General Secretary of Unison, Lord Richard Harrington, Conservative peer, former Refugees Minister, Catherine West, Labour's Shadow Minister for Asia and the Pacific, and MP for Hornsey and Wood Green, and Dan Hodges, columnist for The Mail on Sunday. The lines are open now, 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850 or say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC, and do watch us on Global Player.